Welcome, everyone. Today we have Jon Uhler joining us. How are you, Jon?
Good, Gabby. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. I've really been looking forward to having Jon on to speak with us because he comes from such a unique perspective, and Jon has been working in prisons for over a decade, and he was on psychology staff there. So he's actually seen within the prisons so many of the abusers, like the whole range of sexual abusers that are in our prisons, and can really comment on, the patterns and what we're really up against, because I feel like there's so much social engineering at the moment around what an abuser is, why they abuse, and if anything, there's quite a lot of, sympathy building for abusers, which I feel really needs to come back to survivors. So I'm so interested in hearing about your experiences, Jon, and just how this I guess this world and this mission for speaking out for our children started for you. So for people that haven't come across your work before, Jon, would you be able to give them a bit of an intro into how this all started for you, and just, your insights into, what makes someone become a predator, and, how what actually drives these predators to abuse our children?
Gabby, again, it's a pleasure to be with you. My background kind of is broken into thirds, maybe fourths. Worked in all sorts of settings, community-based settings and hospital. That's when I learned about trauma. So trauma, fortunately, was outside of my own personal experience, but working in a hospital, that's where I came across. It was a Christian-based program, so it was a spiritual program as well. That's where I learned about trauma, and therefore that's when I started to work with sexual abuse survivors, including some that are or experienced SRA, so satanic ritual abuse. That is something that I didn't know about, shall we say, multiplicity. It's probably still a term that we can use. So when trauma is significant enough, it can shatter the personality or cause segmentation to happen. So I worked extensively with trauma survivors, primarily those that had been sexually abused, those that had been ritualistically abused. I didn't have that label on my specialization, but it just turns out that those that tend to be wrestling with the most profound issues, there's usually a reason why.
Yeah.
So I have a extensive background working with sexual abuse survivors, and changed to working with kids in the system, really some of the hardest cases, as the residential facility that I was with, but I worked in the foster care end of things as well, as far as group homes and then residential treatment. But we worked in the largest facility west of the Mississippi, so 120 kids on grounds, 3 levels of severity. And then from there, actually was recruited to head up one of the counties in Pennsylvania to revamp their child welfare system. I did that for a time, and then opened up my own adolescent female, so teen girls group home. I was doing that for a couple of years, and then the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections came knocking, and in a good way, Yeah, that's right. But I wasn't interested, but they were persistent, and the chief psychologist of one of the prisons heard about me, probably through a couple of different sources, and that sounds flattering, but I think it was the result of what the current and existing at the time psychology staff were being requested to do. They were pretty much all probably going to go on strike in their own way.
Wow.
And that was to start what would amount to the first treatment program, intensive treatment program in the US for guys in long-term solitary confinement. And so through that, so I was the one to start that. They didn't label it as such, but now in retrospect, that's what I did. And so through that, I accumulated or accrued more clinical contact hours, we say boots on the ground clinical contact hours, than any single prison psychology staff member in the US or Canada. So I hold the record. How's that? That'll really, that's a claim to fame. But as a matter of fact, I'm just finishing a podcast where I try to give people perspective, because I didn't really give myself enough credit, because now I'm leveraging that as I deal with predators or predator apologists, we should say, because I'm not published yet. I just haven't taken the time. That is really the only defense that the predator apologists can throw up. I mean, not kind of vomit as well, but to throw in my way, which is, well, we don't need to listen to you. You're not published.
Yeah.
So I ran the numbers, and I thought, okay, that's something that they're going to have to contend with, because I dug deep into the criminal mind in that setting, and I really understand it, and therefore I really have come to understand psychopaths and sociopaths and other things that you find in prison, including sexual predators. So I worked in the solitary unit for 6 solid years, and then was able to transition out of there to head up one of Pennsylvania's standalone high-intensity sex offender programs. It's a specialized program, and that primarily the folks that are assigned to that, as far as residents, those that are going through treatment, are sexually violent predators. So oversaw treatment of a specialized forensic unit. From there, was certified in the Hare psychopathy checklist. They flew, the Department of Corrections flew Robert Hare out from British Columbia. And so we went through a specialized training. And from there, was doing specialized assessments, was doing a lot of parole evaluations in my capacity, risk assessments, sex offender risk assessments, and then also oversaw the mental health unit, oversaw drug and alcohol on the outpatient program from the psychology staff side, and then was the point person for veterans, of all things, as well. So after 11 plus years, decided there was probably life outside of prison for myself. So I retired. I was
Long enough sentence.
retirement age. So I started a training program because I was most concerned, and still am, most concerned about churches, because the most sophisticated of predators will actually target churches. So I have a training site called churchprotect.org, and that has a lot of my research information on there. Then after doing training for a while, that is still operational, but I noticed during the trainings, the focus was more on the perpetrators, understandably, because I was there to train on that. But the best way to help a church protect itself is to help support survivors. So I shifted focus a little bit, and then created SurvivorSupport.net, and that's my primary site. SurvivorSupport.net, the 2 words are all scrunched together, no space or no underscore, and that really is designed for survivors. That is an adjunct to therapy. So if anybody wants to kind of keep the momentum going in between sessions, that's what that site is for. I also have a blog, SurvivorSupport.us, and then I'm part of a new international task force against the sexualizing of kids through the trans deception. And that's called the SOGI International Task Force. That's SOGI123taskforce.com. And then I have a Friday night live program where I deal with counseling topics.
Wow, you're a busy man, Jon.
Busy. I do counseling during the day, and we're now going to start I'm going to start my 3rd sex offender treatment program. So I'm certified trauma specialist, do counseling during the day, full-time caseload with teletherapy. And then I do sex offender treatment. I just finished one of these sex offender treatment groups. just before speaking with you.
Wow.
So,
Such an incredible perspective to be working with survivors and also the sex offenders. Like, it's just so very unique, Jon. And regardless of whether you're published or not, I think very, very few people, that are put in a public position to speak on these topics, by the system, would have those kind of contact hours and the hands-on experience that you have. So I would love to hear, your perspective on, from seeing such a diverse range of perpetrators against children. What do you think drives their behaviour, and encourages them to become a perpetrator to begin with? Because we're taught very much by what's out in the media, our courts, our politicians, that it's abusers abuse all the time, that abusers have had this happen to them, and that certainly is the case in generational families, which we talk a lot about with the cults and SRA families, etc. But there's also another population that's in prison, and there's probably more of these because they're not as protected, that have come into child abuse not from a family situation but through experiences in the world and etc. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that as well.
in brief, what I tell people is that we've come to believe, or certain the pedophiles and pro-pedophile camp, quite frankly, has been able to use academic research to its advantage to create what I call urban legends. And most of us have heard those. I read in grad school exactly what you referenced, which is that abusers somehow are acting out their own abuse upon victims of the age that they themselves were perpetrated upon. So it is this unconscious desire to somehow work out their own trauma. Mm-hmm. And they're choosing a victim at the same age. I'm here to tell you that is a lie.
Wow.
That is not true. And I can tell you why. Because I studied real hard what academic researchers would give their eye teeth to be able to have access to what I had access for 11 years. An outside academic researcher, and I'm not faulting them, but I knew early on what kind of gold mine in terms of research material I had available to me. Because at best, an outside academic researcher, it's very laborious, the process to try to get into a prison if you are from the outside. It's very controlled in terms of your interview and the interview process. And it's going to be listened to either by the officer that's in the room or by a speaker or the person that's interviewing you. And typically the people that are being interviewed are sex offenders and typically are pedophiles. So either the kinds of sex offenders that people want to interview are mass murderers or pedophiles. So and then the question is, how do they sign up? Who do they choose? So the researcher either has a name, Ted Bundy, BTK killer, Dennis Rader, or they're just going to come in and they will leave it up to the prison system or the particular prison. Actually, we're coming in, we'd like 4, we'd like 6, because they're limited in the amount of time the researcher is. So can you imagine if a researcher was given a set of keys and was given 11 years,
yeah,
8 hours a day, to be able to call any inmate into his office for as many sessions as he wanted, or to go to long-term solitary? Because if an inmate is misbehaving, they actually cannot participate in an interview. So I could go. I was the one that, as a matter of fact, if they were misbehaving on the psychology staff is actually called down. So I took advantage of that purposely, because for me, it was very important to find out because of my work with survivors prior to working in the prison system. And so my background was pretty unique. Anyways, most people have a criminal justice background who work on psychology staff. It's very rare that somebody, they call from the street, an actual therapist, works in prison, because you really can't do effective therapy per se. It's just not geared for it. But if you're an effective therapist, you can still do some effective work. But the average psychology staff on a prison or in a prison psychology staff, they're not there, and they aren't really all that inclined to spend extra time, as it were. Plus, we have a lot of things on our plate on psychology staff.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing, a conundrum or an interesting juxtaposition, that those that wish they could have the access that we had don't. So the academic researchers would never be able to have the kind of access I did. But I wasn't alone in my access as far as other psychology staff members. I was the only one that really took the time developing charts, because I was driven to try to figure out, how does a man end up, since I was working in a male prison, how does a man end up being a woman or a child's worst nightmare? How did they get that way? So I went into my research. It was really field research, embedded field research, little by little, trying to figure out, and you have to do it with a certain degree of finesse so that you actually get truthful responses. I wanted to know, again, was it hardwired? Was it trauma? And initially, I assumed that somehow, as we've all heard, that they're reenacting. But because of my background with trauma survivors, I quickly discovered this was not the case. If you are a non-survivor, so if you've never been traumatized, you can't fake it.
Yeah.
There's very characteristic things of survivors. Here's one that's very characteristic. A survivor will be protective, not exploitive. If you have a group of 5 women, let's say they've all taken their kids to the park. Kids are playing in the playground, mothers are talking. Let's say 2 of those mothers are survivors. There, I said 5, but let's say we have 5 women. Let's say between them, maybe we have 10 kids. Let's say 2 are survivors of the 5 women. If somebody standing off were to watch those women, so not a creepy guy, but let's say we were to
An observer.
But yeah, that's right. What would we notice those 5 women doing as they were talking? Would we notice anything about the 2? Well, the 2 are going to have a hard time attending to the conversation. Why?
Yeah. Well, survivors have a lot of hypervigilance. So
Right? They're the ones
like,
scanning.
what's around me? Like,
okay, they're scanning all the time.
safe.
Right? They're talking, but they're looking. They're talking because nobody's going to get close to those kids. The other 3, because they weren't traumatized, let's say, weren't sexually abused, they're not by nature hypervigilant. They're not the helicopter parents, so to speak, what they call. Okay. So by nature, a survivor is protective, not exploitive.
Oh, makes
That's
sense.
different than child on child offenses. We're all familiar with that, and it's very real. We all understand that a 5-year-old that was perped on will act out. Now, 100% guarantee they're going to act on another child? No. But we know that if a 5-year-old has perped on a younger child, we know that 5-year-old has been perped on.
Definitely.
Now the question is this. Once the perpetration has taken place on the younger kid, so now we have an older child, age 5 or 6, do you think we will notice with the new victim, age 3 or 4, do you think there will be some sort of behavioral change? Of course there will be, one extreme or the other. That 3 or 4-year-old is going to start acting out or acting in. They're going to become aggressive or they're going to become withdrawn one of the two extremes because of the power of the emotions. The flip side of hurt is anger. What are they going to do with that anger? Anger produces adrenaline. That's what we call anxiety, but it's really adrenaline, by the way.
Wow.
So within a very brief period of time, within an hour, within, just after the event, we're going to start to notice behavioral changes.
Yeah.
So again, let's say we have a 5 or 6-year-old and a 3 or 4-year-old, give or take. Immediately, we're going to start seeing behavioral changes, just like the young child that is now the perpetrator is now acting out. What is the likelihood that we would ever see a child now, age 3 or 4? That's prior to grade 1 or first grade. That's usually about age 5. Okay. Do we think it's plausible that a child could reach grade 4 or the 4th grade without anybody noticing that that child's been perped on? If you have somewhat mindful administrators and teachers, my wife was a 30-year-old, 30-year second grade school teacher, right? She notices.
Yeah.
You notice kids that are withdrawn. You notice the kids that are having a hard time, kids that are acting out. You notice because the child is not attending to math or reading. They can't. They have all sorts of emotions. So certainly by 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, we're going to start to notice behavioral changes. Then hormones kick in, and in one way or another, because other kids are starting to now notice in terms of noticing sex and sexuality, now it compounds things. It is not plausible to believe that somebody can go through the younger grades, or here in the States called elementary school years, middle school or junior high, or grade 6 and 7 and 8, kind of in there, and then high school, all the way through, having been perpetrated against and show no signs, appear perfectly well adjusted. In fact, you are rather gregarious. You can even be president of the class. You're homecoming queen or king. So we don't think in terms of somebody that's been perped on being top of the class. Now, that's going to be the kid that has self-injurious behaviors. That's a kid that's going to have an eating disorder, going to have psychiatric issues, mood swings, bipolar. We've got depression. We've got anxiety. We've got drinking. We've got drugs going on. We've got self-injurious behavior.
So that would be, Jon, that would be a child that has internalized the abuse. Is that right?
There we go. And even the ones that haven't, there's still going to be some sort of, the ones that have not internalized it, they're going to become aggressive. They're going to be the problem management. They're going to have the behavioral issues, right? They're very aggressive.
Yeah.
They're going to come to the school's attention. What we're being told, what we're being sold is that somebody can reach their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, be well adjusted, so much so that they're in positions of trust, responsibility, authority, have no paper trail in terms of mental health issues. After they're busted, they'll say they did, but they still won't be able to produce any proof. Okay. And these are the people that everybody around them, by the time these guys were busted, and this is really what it comes down to, by the time the arrest happens and the news crew goes out and interviews people that knew the perpetrator, what you won't hear with the ones that we're talking about that were well adjusted, got into a position of power or authority or trust, and they used that to perpetrate on, whether a pastor, whether a principal, teacher, coach, you name it, athletic director, medical personnel, soccer, Boy Scout leader, whatever. The news crew goes out, interviews some people, including neighbors. What you're not going to hear is, oh yeah, it doesn't surprise me, that guy was a creepy guy. You're not going to hear that. What you're going to hear is, are you sure they have the right guy? It can't be him. Not him. They're going to interview people at church, not Pastor so-and-so. They're going to interview family members. I can't believe it. We never suspect there. That's not someone that was perped on as a kid. As I tell people, if you want to do proper research on survivors, adult survivors that have ended up in prison, you're not going to interview them. You're not going to do the research on the sex offender unit. You're going to do that research on the drug and alcohol unit.
Yeah.
Because true survivors aren't going to perp. They're not perpetrators. They're not exploitive. They are protective. That's why the majority of inmates want to kill pedophiles that are in prison. Well, if ever you have a sort of a non-judgmental population, it is in prison. They don't care what each other's done, except one population within a population. And the question is this: why are they, quote unquote, judgmental? Why do they have an issue with the pedophiles? Because there are no secrets in prison, and they know, and they haven't bought the lie that is sold in the academic literature, because they know how you become a pedophile. That's why they want to kill the pedophiles. And they know what I learned, which is this: somebody becomes a sophisticated pedophile. That's the kind that nobody suspected, and they have lots of victims and held a position that was typically, here's the other piece, that position is typically a mandated reporter position.
Wow.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, to be a mandated reporter, you can't have any criminal history. They do a background check on you. You got to be squeaky clean. Yeah. You can't be erratic. You can't be questionable.
Yeah.
You have to be above board. So that means you're really adept at impression management, which means, quite frankly, they're psychopaths, which is very true.
Wow.
The ones that are the most sophisticated are the ones that have multiple victims. They were not perpetrated upon because there is no proof. And where does the research get that information? And this is crucial as well. So we've been told, we've learned that, or at least what we're being sold, is that these pedophiles are reenacting. And I have a couple of questions that clarifies that. Well, how do we know? Have we seen any films? No. Any witnesses that the men that are in prison, that are the sophisticated pedophiles, meaning we're in position of trust that nobody suspected. Any witnesses? Because they're saying, when I was a child, I was perped on. Okay, where's the proof? As a matter of fact, they can't even produce a paper trail for any kind of counseling. So that means they were well adjusted through school. Yeah. No, what we're being asked is to trust what's coming out of their mouths. It's called their self-report. So we're being asked to trust the world's greatest deceivers and liars.
Yeah.
And we're going to assume that what they're telling us is accurate. And so the naive or agenda-driven researcher is sitting across from the pedophile. And the pedophile's actually made it known that he's a pedophile. So the question is, why would he do that? That's pretty risky. That's correct. He's actually protected. How did he make it known? Because in most prisons, if a researcher is coming in and he wants to have access to pedophiles, they will put a notice on the housing unit or cell block. Well, the inmates have to sign up for that, right? That's how we're going to get our sample. Okay. There are no secrets in prison. Nobody discusses their sex offense, especially the pedophiles. Well, everybody knows that a researcher's coming in. When a researcher's coming in, the researcher is here. What's the researcher about? Oh, calling for the sex offender unit, right? And everybody watches. That's a death sentence virtually, unless they're really well protected by the prison administration. How they do that? They get in their good graces. How do they do that? They ingratiate themselves. They're in position. They're like the shop steward kind of thing, or they help with clerical things. They buddy up with. Why and how do they do that? Because they already were doing that on the street before they were busted. They use the same skills and then they perfect them. And they use the interview, and this is what the interviewer doesn't understand. The interviewer thinks they're going to get definitive information. And it's not that they can't get some information, but the interviewer thinks that the inmate is sitting down for an interview for the best interest of society.
Yeah.
Further research. No, the inmate is practicing for parole.
Wow.
And the inmate is seeing how much the interviewer is going to buy what he's saying. And that's how they started to say, well, I was abused. And when I started to hear the phrase, well, Mr. Uhler, because I would ask, well, so you were perped on? Yeah. But you kind of did that. Yeah. Why do you think you did that? Now, I know the guy's full of it right now, just at that moment, because survivors are protective, not exploitive. Why do you think you did that? Well, Mr. Uhler, hurt people hurt people. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that phrase. And I thought, I'll let it go by a couple of times. And then I thought, wait a second. So I said, repeat that. Well, hurt people. And I said, no, hurt people. Like, oh, people that were hurt, they turn around and hurt people. Said, oh, okay. So that's what happened. And they said, yeah. Okay, so you were hurt and therefore you reenacted. I said, wow, that's interesting. Well, how'd that feel when you were being hurt? Oh, I didn't like it. But you decided, knowing how it felt, you decided to do what? Why would you do that? And that was the first time they knew, guys in my group, the gig was up.
Busted.
And I wasn't going to fly. And guess what? They didn't try it anymore. In the other groups, they were doing it.
Wow.
So the urban legend, at least in my groups, the guys that work with me, they know that I know they're lying through their teeth, because you can't fake being a survivor, because by the time somebody perpetrates on a child, they are a psychopath. The psychopath has three qualities, and it all comes down to conscience. They don't have one. Why? Not because it's not nature, nurture, genetics. I want everybody to understand this. What do we have in the study of psychopathy? By the way, we have brain scans at a point in time. Guy's age 35, put him through a scan. We have a static picture of his brain. There was a dynamic picture, but at age 30, we see what his brain is like. Everything else is conjecture.
Yeah.
Right? I can tell you that if a guy has a psychopathic brain, he has a psychopathic brain. There's no coming back from that. That is very true.
Wow, that's so interesting.
But at age 30, if I'm looking at a psychopathic brain, and people can look up online, just look up images, brains of psychopaths. James Fallon actually has a psychopathic brain, and everybody thinks that's amazing because he found it out accidentally as he scanned his own brain for a Alzheimer's study. But it turns out he looks at it, the name was covered, and he thought, the other group that we do for forensic research, the film must have gotten the wrong pile. So he peels back the name and it's his brain. So he's done well for himself. So his dog and pony his thing, and he does a good job, is he has the brain of a psychopath. And so everybody's amazed at James Fallon, because it's like, as a matter of fact, when he talks, everybody leans in because we want to find out, what is this like? What I say is this: they lean in because we think, based upon what Robert Hare and others have said, they've said that psychopaths are rare.
Yeah.
And I say they're not.
Wow.
And we don't know what to do with James Fallon because he's not in prison. So they've given him a label, or he gave himself a label, pro-social psychopath. Not pro-social. Psychopath does everything for himself. Now, ready?
Selfish.
I call it a really self-controlled, self-disciplined psychopath.
Wow.
Where do you find them? Politics, finance, the ministry, education, law enforcement, psychology, everywhere around your holiday table. A psychopath is different than a sociopath. Best way to view it is on a continuum. A sociopath is all about sales. But to be a good salesperson, you have to feel really self-entitled to what somebody else has, and you're going to talk them out of it. Right? If you have something I want, I have one of two ways. I either take it by force, I'm going to go to prison at some point in time, probably, or I convince you. Well, what gives me the right? Why do I think I have the right to talk you into or out of what is yours? Because I feel really good about myself, which makes me a narcissist. So narcissism comes first, then polishing the technique. You can be a simple narcissist, you're not going to get very far in life. But if you're a narcissist that is polished, now you're going to go into sales.
Yeah.
But in sales, if you stop at sociopathy, then you're going to continue to work somebody, we call that grooming, until it takes too much effort or time or energy. And then you're going to move on. Cost benefit analysis. That's a sociopath. It's all sales. If you keep going and ego keeps building off the straight and narrow down the slippery slope, then something happens to you, and it's no longer about what you can get or the benefits you derive. It then transitions into power and control, but then it transitions into psychopathy. That's actually the beginning of it. And the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath is this. A sociopath will never get personal, and they're just very pragmatic. And once the cost outweighs the benefit, they'll move on. But a psychopath is driven by the thrill of the hunt, and they have to have the last word, last say, and last laugh. You deny them of that by placing boundaries. And now you will hear something from a psychopath that you won't hear from a sociopath. A psychopath will say, when boundaries are drawn, they'll say this. With facial expression as well, they'll look at you and say, really? And you just told me no. And if I'm a psychopath, I say, really? And I either say it or I think it. Game on. Now, I'm never going to leave. I'm going to prove to you, how dare you that you were going to put limits on me? Meaning you were going to tell me no? Okay, a sociopath thinks that's crazy. You can have a group, maybe 15 guys in prison, the majority of whom will probably be sociopathic by degree, or they wouldn't be in prison.
Yeah.
They were getting over on boundaries. But you can have one or two or three psychopaths in there, and the sociopaths will look at the psychopath and go, like, oh my gosh,
The whole level.
that guy's really extreme. Okay.
Yeah.
The psychopath, the classic thing is the psychopaths say, oh yeah, well that's it. I'll burn this sucker to the ground. I'll sit on top of the ashes. I'll show them. I don't care if there's nothing left. Well, sociopath, that means he's burned everything to the ground. Why do you want to do that? Because that means you don't get anything. See, that's what a sociopath is saying. What? Take the money and run. What do you mean burn it to the ground? What? That's stupid. Yeah. So a psychopath shocks a sociopath.
Wow.
But the psychopath will look at the sociopath and say, you guys are a bunch of putts. It's so different by nature because they've gone further. Yeah. And now layer a psychopath with financial interest, and now we call it a financial psychopath. They go into Wall Street. They go into politics. You layer it with sex and sexuality, and now they own Epstein Island.
Yeah. So they really
now they'll run modeling agencies. Yeah. They will legalize prostitution. They will traffic children. They will craft the trans movement.
So sophisticated, isn't it?
They will sexualize children with sexualized sex ed material, to where now A child's boundaries have already been crossed. They've been groomed. And the one thing a psychopath, including a sociopath, but certainly a psychopath, the one thing a psychopath is all about is not just taking, not just getting, but leaving a negative, lasting impact, scarring and marring the soul and the mind and the heart. That's what they get off on. That's why, with the psychopath, and anybody that would harm a child is a psychopath. How can I say that? In the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, there's an additional layer of assessment that's done by what's called the Sex Offender Assessment Board, the SOAB board. They use in their assessment, so it's another layer that the judge will look at. So not only do we on psychology staff in prison produce our own assessment, but the SOAB board uses, along with other assessments, the hair psychopathy checklist for pedophiles. Every single pedophile that is listed as a sexually violent predator, which is a designation given by a judge. And so there's not always going to be consistency. But if somebody's given the designation of SVP, sexually violent predator, they will automatically have to go before the SOAB board. SOAB board actually sort of asked me to become an assessor. But they, in their assessment, will automatically use the hair psychopathy checklist. So if the hair psychopathy checklist is automatically used by the Sex Offender Assessment Board, and they're automatically used on pedophiles that are designated sexually violent predators, then a pedophile is within the realm of psychopathy. And I submit to cross the boundaries of a child.
Yeah.
You are not attracted to their body, and by the way, that's another myth. So the minor attracted person, that's a lie. That's a grand fabricated thing. Okay. They are driven to leave a lasting impact. And it's very interesting from a Christian perspective. A little phrase says that Satan comes to steal and destroy.
Yeah.
And when Jesus said, better someone hang a millstone around their own neck, it's interesting, the Greek word for millstone is scandalon. Well, we get in the English the word scandalize. And it's like Jesus was saying this to the person who was considering it. It's like he was saying, you're about to place something around the neck of a child that they will stumble over the rest of their life, especially between themselves and God. You're going to affect that child in significant ways, especially ultimately, if there's a loving God, then why did I go through this? It's like Jesus was saying, you have one of two options. If you're even thinking about putting that around that child, you better hang that around your neck. And the fact that he said, biggest rock, deepest ocean, you can drown in a puddle. That shows you God's protective heart, and God is very angry when anybody's perpetrated against a child. So for any survivor, they need to be able to begin to be willing to risk, knowing that God is very angry on their behalf, that they went through that.
Absolutely. I think that's such a massive thing for so many survivors to work through, as you were saying before, especially with the church and these, the abusers that are so sophisticated, finding a home in there where they can access children, and they have all this respect, and there's really like mind control and social conditioning of the parents, because often the parents won't want to speak out and offend the church or the pastor rather than listen to their children as well. So it's so multi-layered. So yeah, it's great that you're speaking about that huge journey for survivors to come back to God and to heal enough to understand that it wasn't him that did it to you, it was the enemy. And there's no cases that's more, I guess, diabolical than SRA cases, because quite often in those instances, children have actually been abused by people dressed up as Jesus. Like, I speak to survivors here in Australia that have experienced that, and just suit programming, and to actually go through those memories and, have to convince yourself and, their hurt parts as children, that actually wasn't of God, that actually wasn't of Jesus. It's such a big journey. So yeah, I know that you've spoken with and work with and do some amazing work healing for SRA survivors. So I'd love to hear, your perspective on what's worked for them with their healing, what's been most powerful, and just the patterns that you've seen come up with all of your many years of experience.
Yeah. For those that aren't quite sure if SRA is real, and I didn't necessarily know as I started my journey as a therapist, I didn't even know there was trauma, let alone back then it used to be called multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder. If people are not familiar, by the way, with a new model of counseling, and it's really reframing in order to demystify how one explains dissociation and the segmentation of the personality. So I highly recommend people can go online and look up internal family systems therapy, so IFS. Dick Schwartz and Frank Anderson have done a wonderful job. Both are with Harvard School of Medicine. Frank Anderson was the consulting psychiatrist for the movie Inside Out, where little Riley has the emotions and all the emotions. She moves from Minnesota to San Francisco and she's got these conflicting emotions. So I think it's Pixar or Disney that did that film. It's a really good depiction of, shall we say, parts. So Frank Anderson has been instrumental in the new model called internal family systems. And what that model is attempting to do is to normalize and destigmatize internal parts.
Yeah.
And it's very effective in the sense that once somebody can risk believing they're crazy, so that's one of the first steps, right? Because by the way, there's about five reasons for voices. Let me describe those quickly, just so this will probably be helpful. It's 5 reasons for voices. If you hear voices, you're not crazy. Here's how to figure out kind of what they are. The first is negative self-talk. We all tend to have negative self-talk, but for the kind that would be problematic, it would be kind of very profound negative self-talk. Person's always almost like Charlie Brown. He's got this rumination going on. Okay. The next would be introjects, which is you can virtually hear your parent's voice, right? It's almost that recorded thing, like ang, ang, ang. Okay, so that would be different than parts, right? But that's just if you were on the receiving end of a lot of nagging, that can actually end up going in, and now you hear your dad's or your mom's voice. Okay. The third would actually be from multiplicity or parts. Okay. The fourth would be due to genuine schizophrenia, and that's crazy. Okay, those are crazy voices, and I'll describe that in a moment. The fifth would be demon possession. Let me speak to that real fast. Our only reference, and this is kind of where I go, is in the New Testament. You have probably the best description of demon possessed people. And what I tell people is this: from what we see, and it's Jesus or Paul talking, or the situations, the instances, the question is, how much dialogue took place between the demon and Jesus or the demon and Paul? Not a lot. That's probably a safe, so you haven't got a lot of internal dialogue going on. Okay. Somebody that has parts or segmentation personality, they got stuff going on all the time. As a matter of fact, they'll say, the IFS will use the term the protective or protector part. It used to be that the critic, those tend to be actually one and the same. What's nice about IFS, by the way, the premise is that each part of me, each part of a survivor, actually intends for the best. They're trying their best. So instead of shutting that part of you up, you actually need to get to know that part. So that's interesting. Now, difference between crazy voices and non-crazy voices is this. If you're worried about someone thinking you're crazy, then you're not crazy.
I spoke to Lisa,
Okay,
another
right?
beautiful survivor, a few weeks ago.
So
Yeah.
that's it. So here's the quick assessment. If you hear stuff on the inside and you hesitate to tell someone about it because you don't want to, yeah, and you got to be mindful of who you're going to tell. But if you're worried because if you tell that, they're going to think you're crazy, then you're not crazy. That's reasonable. A crazy person, when they hear voices, do they hesitate to tell you what the voices say? No, they tell you. And I
Yeah.
didn't know that until working in the prison with actually crazy people, right? And so the reason why you use the phrase, oh, the tinfoil hat, they're not hiding their tinfoil hat, they're wearing it. Why? Because the voices. And the voices, here's the difference as well. The crazy voices come from the outside in. The Norwegian antenna, Mr. Uhler's broadcasted, the mothership. And so they put on this tinfoil hat. Okay. There's a difference between voices from the outside in versus the inside in.
Mm.
Inside in means you're not crazy. It means you got a lot of dialogue going on. What needs to happen is you starting to risk believing that it's more than just your imagination, that the back and forth dialogue is actually real and it's been going on a long time. And for whatever reason, for such a time as this, things are starting to break down, and that's why it's starting to get crazier. And that's why the dissociation, and dissociation simply is a gap of memory.
Yeah.
And the question is this: if you can't recall, I mean, we all forget glasses and keys and those kind of things. You know, we lose track of things, but that's different than losing hours or days or weeks and having no clue. And one thing that you'll find very characteristic of somebody that experiences dissociation is they're obsessive compulsive. Why? Because they have to keep control of things. Why? Because they feel crazy. Why? Because they're losing track of time and they don't want people to feel they are crazy. Okay. Panic attacks are another thing. Panic attacks are a massive surge of adrenaline. If you want to stop feeling crazy, then you're going to have to get to know yourself because things are starting to come up.
Yeah.
And you have what I call, you've got the best friends you could ever want, but you're disconnected from them. And what's been happening is you've been either ignoring them or trying to shut them down. And how well has that been working?
Yeah.
The most effective method that I know of is journaling.
Absolutely.
And I recommend you risk what? Begin a dialogue with them. So write a question such as this, especially if you've listened to this. It's, well, what does anybody think about what Jon said? Set it aside for a while and then come back. But are you going to be okay if you see something written? And usually the handwriting is going to look different. If you've noticed that you've had various kinds of handwriting, various styles, and there's consistency, or if anybody's ever told you, man, you kind of shift in personality, that's why a lot of survivors have been given the term or the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder or bipolar. It's not. It's the shifting of mood states, it's parts. Okay, because true bipolar is cyclical, like a woman's period cycle. So if your mood does this, then you probably have bipolar. If your mood looks like a Richter scale, you don't have bipolar.
Wow.
You have parts that are shifting in and out. Yeah. And so you need to be able to get to know them. They need finally to have the quarterback of the football team, US football, that kind of, or any kind of sport, got to huddle up. Right now, they have been used to you not being a part of it, or the captain has not been on the bridge. The captain's been in his stateroom, his or her stateroom. They've been doing what they need to do, but they're getting tired and things are getting overwhelmed. The ultimate goal for me as I work with folks that experience this is everybody needs to be on the same page like they're in a boardroom. ultimately you need to be at the end in the CEO or the chairman's position right now because you haven't earned their trust. It sounds strange. You're just in the middle. And little by little, as you get to know them, eventually the next stage is you're going to help each of them get to know each other. And then, little by little, you will become very familiar with the different parts. You'll have a sense of each of them so that you will be able to huddle up very quickly and determine what will be in your best interest in any given moment, in any kind of communication, any kind of relationship, so that you can make sure that the choices and decisions and conversations you're having are going to help be productive.
Wow. That's such a brilliant explanation, Jon. I think, obviously, as a survivor myself, I can definitely, see how that would be so beneficial. And I know through my healing journey and remembering journey, it's really been, accepting, facing our shadow. And I feel like collectively as a society, even if you haven't experienced, this kind of abuse directly, we're collectively having to look at what's been happening in the world as well. So there's so many layers to that. And, the more we can get to know ourselves, it's such a superpower at this time, because we can be aware of, the different things that are coming up for us. Like, even if you haven't experienced this trauma, it might be how you react in a state of fear. What emotions you go into when something, unexpected happens. And if you know potentially what can come up for you, you can plan better. And, these parts of ourselves that we've spent so long pushing away because society tells us it's not appropriate to feel that anger. It's not appropriate to not have forgiveness for this person. It's not appropriate to be, acting out or, wanting to talk about topics that other people don't want to listen to. If we can learn to accept those parts within ourselves, it just creates such a way of balance going through. And I know so many survivors are finding that, as they start journaling and start, asking those open-ended questions, like you were saying as well, Jon, there's so much information, there's so much healing as we accept those parts of ourselves and come back into being whole. And I think that's really important. A thing to mention as well is, while we are dissociated and we have parts of ourselves that we're rejecting, when that dissociation, you can be programmed again, you can be manipulated, you could be caused to be reactive and caused division or arguments, or a whole lot worse. It could go, as far as like an MK Ultra program being activated. So, this work with internal family systems is just brilliant in, showing people how easy it is to, like you said, call a meeting, welcome, various parts of ourselves that haven't had the opportunity to talk or voice themselves, or different memories to come forward. And, what a brilliant opportunity to heal.
That's right.
Mm.
Gabbi, it's been a pleasure. I know
Absolutely.
you've given me an open-ended opportunity, but because I have a meeting here in a moment, if you'll have me, I'd love to come back, because it's fun for me. It's fun, but it's enjoyable considering all the other things I deal with.
That's good.
I love the idea of being able to help survivors, and if we can arrange it again, well, we could talk about it, helping survivors understand that really the key to their healing is understanding their anger. Without anger, you're never going to heal, which is very different than what we're told.
Yeah.
And you don't have to forgive if someone's not sorry, because if you try to forgive, then you're actually doing something that is impossible and not healthy. So we could talk about that. And then what do you do when the memories are coming up? And what do you do when it starts to really feel chaotic? And how do you begin to understand the lay of the land on the inside? So we can talk about that as well. I just invited myself back.
Yeah. Well, you've saved me having to do it, because I just think, you're such a wealth of knowledge with your experience. It's just such a unique perspective. So thank you so much, Jon. And I look forward to having you back again soon.
That's wonderful. Gabbi, thank you.